everyone, this is Joanne Dunbar and I am doing a video for my Module 2 discussion. Please bear with me as I'm navigating between my notes and my textbook and my online readings, so hopefully this will go fairly smoothly and I won't have to do too many takes. I'm going to start out with the first discussion question, which is pick two behaviorist theories and models discussed in Chapter 3 and explain how they are reflected in literacy instruction and research. So for the behaviorist theories, I chose connectionism and operant conditioning. So the first theory that I'm going to talk about is connectionism. In page 44 of the Tracy and Morrow text, it discusses Thorndike's law of effect, which states, if an act is followed by a satisfying change in the environment, the likelihood that the act will be repeated in similar situations increases. So this is known as the principle of reinforcement. So when we think about positive and negative reinforcement, I believe that this is the law that is at play. Thinking about classroom applications, I think of one of my behavior management interventions that I do in my classroom is I do a ticket system. So this is primarily for the positive side of things. So I have these little tickets printed on colorful paper. They say great job, wonderful, etc. And at certain times when I really want to motivate my students to be doing what they're supposed to be doing, I just walk around and randomly hand out tickets to the students who are doing what they are supposed to be doing. Most often that it involves starting out class. They come in, they know what they're supposed to do every single day. It's written on the board what they're supposed to have out, what their warm-up is, but a lot of students aren't super motivated to come in and immediately start working. They want to come in and socialize for as long as they're allowed to do so. So rather than just standing up there and continually telling them what they should be doing, even though they already know, I will just kind of walk around and reward the ones who are already doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then every other Friday, or sometimes every Friday, I do a ticket exchange where they can exchange their tickets for a prize such as candy. So one ticket gets one piece of candy, or they can save up their tickets and get a coupon for a more substantial reward. So I think of that when I read about connectionism and Thorndike's law, because that's kind of just the whole idea of reinforcement for behavior. Now, Thorndike's law is also broken down into three different components. So the law of readiness, according to the Tracy and Morrow text on page 44, states that learning is facilitated when easier tasks precede those that are related but more difficult. So I tried to think of applications from my own experiences in the classroom that tie into each of these laws. And the example that I thought of is more of a instructional perspective. In our reading curriculum in the 6th grade at my school, we emphasized closed reading strategies, and we have a handout that we gave to the students at the beginning of the year with all of these metacognitive marks that they're supposed to make, as well as you number the paragraphs, you chunk the text by breaking up the paragraphs into boxes or brackets, you highlight important information, and then you make margin notes. Well, I found that at the beginning of the year, telling students to do this was pretty useless if they didn't understand the why behind why they had to do this. Like the whole purpose of the closed reading marks. It's not just arbitrarily marking up your paper. So I kind of broke it down into smaller steps. So today we're going to talk about highlighting, and we're going to figure out what things are important in the text that we need to highlight, that we need to pull out, and then what things can we leave, because I would find students are just highlighting the entire thing, or they're highlighting different colors to make it pretty, and there's no real purpose behind their highlighting and underlining. So I kind of broke it down and scaffolded it in that way, and then we did a day where we focused on margin notes, what do we actually write in the margin? Because if we don't understand the purpose for making margin notes, it's completely pointless. So we focused on the main idea of each paragraph. We're going to pull out a phrase or a sentence that says what the main idea is, and we're going to write it. And we're going to do this together, and then you're going to do it on your own. And when I had them independently practice it, they did it with a smaller text, and then after they had a couple of times practicing that, I gave them a multi-page article to do their close reading strategies on. So that kind of is what the law of readiness reminded me of. Moving on to the law of identical elements. This is defined as the more elements of one situation are identical to the elements of a second situation, the greater the transfer, and thus the easier the learning in the second situation. So I thought of a tie-in from my classroom having to do with this law. The students we do vocabulary, and they each have their own consumable vocabulary book that's broken down into units, and one unit is 20 new vocabulary words, and we take 2 weeks and complete it. So the first half of the exercises, where they're filling in the blank with the correct word, they're choosing the correct word out of a couple of choices, etc. They're finding synonyms, they're finding antonyms. The first half of the unit's exercises are due 1 week. The second half of the unit's exercises are due the second week. And then at the end of the second week, we have a quiz over the words. And the students were very confused, full of questions about what to do, what pages do we do, what do we do for this exercise in the beginning. But all of the units are structured the same way in the book. So now that we're about 6 weeks into the school year, they're picking it up and they're asking fewer and fewer questions because it's the same every week. It's just different words. So the actual procedures and processes as far as the exercises, what exercises do we do, how many sections do we do this week, what day is it due, it's always the same week to week. The assignment is posted, given out on Monday. This is your homework for the week. It's due Thursday, so they have those 3 nights to do their vocabulary homework. Same every week. So they're becoming more and more independent with it because they are able to remember and transfer the prior procedures to the next weeks. Okay, let's see. One final note on that. I found that as far as just procedures for starting class, the more I keep it the same day to day, the better students are at doing it. I have any handout that I'm giving for the day, I have it on a tray in my classroom. It's in the same place. And they know that when they come into class, if there's a handout in the tray, they're supposed to get it. So I had to remind them of that the first few days. Some students picked it up after one day. I told them on the first day of class, whenever there's a paper on this tray, you need to get it. Some students, that's all they needed. They started getting it the next day and they were good from there. Some students needed some more reminders, like maybe for a week or so, you need to get a handout from the tray. Now, there are a few stragglers, but I don't even think that that's due to not remembering. It's more just due to their mind is on other things besides learning, and they're more interested in coming in and socializing than doing what they're supposed to be doing. So that's another tie-in. And then finally, the law of exercise. That states that the more stimulus-response connections are practiced, the stronger the bonds become. That could also be connected to the getting a handout for the warm-up when you come into my class. An example of this that's kind of a non-example, or maybe an example of the opposite effect, would be every now and then I'll start out the school year with a certain procedure that I think I want to use, but then we get a few days into it and it's just not feeling authentic, or it's just not feeling like it's going to work or have a very good effect, and so I'll drop it, or I'll just not use it, and then students don't remember it later on. For example, we were going to do, first couple days of school, I taught my students that when I clap out a rhythm, if I need to get your attention, I'll clap out a rhythm, and then they're supposed to copy it. So I did that a few times and they were kind of picking it up, but then it just didn't really feel authentic to me for whatever reason. I guess it just doesn't go along with my teaching style, or I would forget to do it and I would just say, okay, class, let me get your attention instead. And so I kind of let that fall by the wayside, and the couple of times that I've tried it since then, students, like, they don't really remember what they're supposed to do if I randomly start clapping. So that would be an example of this principle in reverse, I suppose. So, as far as a tie-in from the other readings to the theory of connectionism, I wanted to mention from the Guthrie article on page 3. This was the longer article, the study on motivation in reading. On page 3, this is what I wrote down that ties into connectionism. Highly interested readers have feelings of involvement, stimulation, or enjoyment during reading. And then later on page 28, they state, in contrast, students, actually I'm going to need to find it in the article because I didn't write the entire thing down. While I'm looking for that, let me discuss the first quote that I wrote down. Highly interested readers have feelings of involvement, stimulation, or enjoyment during reading. So this kind of explains, using the theory of connectionism, students are more likely to repeat something if it has a favorable or positive result for them. So naturally, students who have positive feelings as a result from reading are going to want to read more. So that's just kind of the basic law in effect there. That students who find enjoyment, whether it be just getting engrossed in a story or learning about a topic that they enjoy or want to know more about, or they feel connected to characters in a story, those positive feelings, when they have those in response to reading, they're going to want to read more. And so the other quote that I have that I'm finally finding on page 28 of the Guthrie text, in contrast, students with low involvement, low amounts of time spent reading, low efficacy, and low interest in September were not likely to create for themselves the literacy opportunities that would enable them to increase in comprehension. So to me, that's just a fancy way of saying that students that don't have those positive feelings from reading are not going to seek out reading opportunities of their own. They're going to read the bare minimum that they are required to read for what they have to do at school. And I see that every day. And it makes me sad because I understand that there is great intrinsic reward in reading, and not just for me, for many students. And I hate to see students missing out on that. But with that, I need to move on to my next behaviorist theory that I'm going to talk about, which is operant conditioning. So with operant conditioning on page 46 of the Tracy and Morrow text, operant conditioning can also be called programmed learning or programmed instruction. In programmed learning, and I'm reading from the Tracy and Morrow text on page 46, instruction is carefully broken down into small successive steps that are carefully designed to maximize the likelihood of student success and to minimize the likelihood of students' frustration and failure. As students successfully accomplish each step, they are rewarded. So that's kind of just the general definition of that operant conditioning. The first thing that these descriptions made me think of was behavioral objectives in an IEP. I was in special education for 2 years. I'm not doing it anymore, but the last 2 years I was a special education teacher. And in an IEP, one of the components of any IEP is behavioral or academic objectives. So if it's academic, it would be like the student will write a paragraph containing at least 2 compound sentences Behavioral goals were more like the student will initiate a task with 3 prompts or less. And so then the special education teacher had to take data on the frequency of those behaviors. So that's kind of what it reminded me, just specific, that specific nature of the goals and objectives. But I would say, and this is just kind of my own personal gripe against the system, I suppose, is that in those situations I did not feel like clear steps were defined to be able to get the student to that point. That was kind of the missing link for me as a special education teacher. And I mention that because I feel like from my readings and understandings of operant conditioning, a huge component of that theory is the breaking down of steps. How will students get to this place? I think that's also kind of the principle behind backwards design when we talk about instructional planning, that we identify what we want the student to do, and then from there we work backwards in deciding how the student is going to show that they learn that, and then how is the student going to learn it. Another thing that the Tracy and Morrow text talks about with operant conditioning is the schedule of reinforcement. So this is the time period that we are going to give the student to learn it, and then we might increase the time period of reinforcement. So another component of the operant conditioning theory is reinforcement, positive reinforcement for desired behaviors, which to me sounds kind of similar to connectionism. I was a little confused about those similarities, but it does involve positive reinforcement, and so the schedule of reinforcement has to do with the amount of time that passes before the student is reinforced. And so as the student practices and demonstrates the skill with greater frequency, the time until that reinforcement increases. Another component of operant conditioning is shaping. This is on page 48 of the Tracy and Morrow text. In the process of shaping, gross approximations of a behavior are initially reinforced with the use of positive reinforcement. Thereafter, however, only more and more refined approximations of the desired behavior are enforced. This reminds me of actually in my homeroom, so not even a instructional perspective, but just purely behavioral standpoint. At my old school, homeroom did not have to be silent or structured. It was the students came in and hung out till the bell rang, and then they had to be in their seats while we said the pledge and did announcements. At my new school, students are expected to be in their seat silent during homeroom. So that's a 20-minute period. Our students are coming in, they're sitting down. I've got a tiny room with 31 students for my homeroom, and my thought at first was, how in the world am I going to get 31 sixth graders to sit silently for 20 minutes? And so what I did was I decided to use positive reinforcement. Some may call it bribery. I call it positive reinforcement as my initial aid. And I told my students, if you can sit silently for 5 days in a row, I will bring you a treat. And so it took a couple of tries. We had to restart our 5-day streak a couple of times because I would just keep track on the board. If we got a check for that day, then we were successful. If not, we got an X. So a couple of times of restarting, but they got the hang of it. After 5 days, I brought donut holes for them, and I said, you can talk quietly on this day. And then after that, I said, we're going to go for 7 days. Once again, we had to start over a couple times, but by the end of the 7-day streak, it was like I didn't have to tell them. They just came in and they just sat silently. And they're supposed to really be working on homework or reading from their pleasure reading book during this time. Some of them do, some of them don't, but they're silent. And so right now we're doing a 10-day streak, but I don't really have to even remind them anymore. They just come in and sit down silently. And to be honest with you, if you had asked me when I was at my old school, is it possible to get sixth graders to sit silently for 20 minutes doing nothing? I would have said no, that's not worth the fight. So it was an interesting lesson for me that even if you have to start small and you're not sure how to get your students to do a skill, start small, use positive reinforcement, and then just kind of branch it out from there. So really quickly, before I move into constructivist theories, this video is getting a little long, I know. I did have one tie-in from the Hudson and Williams text about reading workshop. I found this article very insightful because I'm not really super familiar with what reading workshop refers to. So this kind of gave me an idea of what it looks like. So I'm going to pull up that text, and this is on page 2. Where they state, reading books every day is the only activity that reliably relates to proficiency in reading, and that it is frequent, wide book reading that creates avid readers. So my thought and my tie-in to operant conditioning is that probably if you have a reader who is not motivated, the place to start is to begin building their reading stamina, because this article really reinforces the fact that students just need to be reading. No matter what, that's kind of one of the most foundational components of building lifelong readers and lovers of reading. They need time to read. And sometimes I get frustrated because I spend a lot of time in my classroom teaching the closed reading strategies, which we're required to do in our school. It's just something we have to do. All of the reading teachers do it. I get frustrated because I wish that I had more opportunities to just read with my students and just let them read. But that was kind of my thought, is that using the theory of operant conditioning as a foundation to build that reading stamina. You start small and then you work your way up from there. We are also kind of using that in my one language arts class that I teach with writing. We're going to build our writing stamina. We're going to free write for 5 minutes. Tomorrow or next week or whenever, we're going to free write for 10 minutes. And then by the end of the year, maybe we can spend a whole class period writing. We'll see. Anyway, I need to move on. So I'm going to move on to my constructivist theories that are discussed in the text. So the two that I chose were inquiry learning and then transactional reader response theory. So I'm going to start by talking about inquiry learning. This, I have to say, it's very appealing to me as a teacher. I do really enjoy more creative project-based things in my class. It's just that I have never taught more gifted learners who tend to handle those situations better. I find that struggling learners, which usually, whether special ed classes obviously or even on level, usually contains many struggling learners, they typically benefit from more structure. So sometimes I feel like I don't get to do as many inquiry-based, problem-based projects as I would like. Maybe one day. But let me go ahead and start talking about the theory. I'm going to define it from the text on page 59. It's talking about John Dewey, one of the first American constructivists, and how he, and this is where I'm going to start reading, emphasized the growth of the individual, the importance of the environment, and the role of the teacher in students' learning. Dewey's philosophy of education became known as inquiry learning. It was designed first and foremost to produce involved citizens capable of successfully participating in and contributing to a democratic society. Okay? It also mentions that this is based on the unfoldment theory, which makes sense to me because the unfoldment theory of learning states that learning happens most effectively when students are engaged and curious about what they're learning about. So an example from my classroom is actually a project that we are going to be working on next week. Next week is weird because it's the week before a break. So we're kind of taking a break from vocabulary because we just finished a unit, and so we're not doing vocabulary. So we decided, my teammates and I, to create a project that's based on a current event that's happening right now, which is Hurricane Florence. So what we have for our students is we are giving them some materials to look through and research, and they need to research what's happening with Florence. They need to research a couple of past hurricanes in the U.S. history. We're thinking Katrina, Harvey, and we're going to give them some materials, probably for the AC classes that my teammates teach. They'll probably just give them the questions and tell them to find the information. For on-level classes, we're actually giving them some articles that they're going to read and pull out information. So they're going to do some research, and they're also going to research hurricane safety. And from those, they're going to create a news broadcast and pretend like they are a news crew, film it on an iPad, and then present it to the class. So that's kind of, I would say, an application of inquiry learning. An important quote about inquiry learning that I found on page 61 of the Tracy and Morrow text says, although it is the teacher's job to create an enticing curriculum and a supportive, motivating environment in the classroom, in the end, it is the student who must actively create his or her own learning. Okay, so I like that because I admit I have felt a little bit of disillusionment when I was originally reading about the unfoldment theory in particular. Whether or not it is realistic to expect that students should always be super engaged in their learning. I think from my perspective as a teacher, because there are certain things that I have to teach them per Common Core, obviously, my attitude sometimes tends to be, I project that on my students. Well, you have to learn this, so like it or not, we're going to learn it. I think that this quote from the text shows a lot of balance. That it is my job to try to make learning as interesting as possible, but it is the student's responsibility as well to want to find interest in the topics. And that, I think, is a matter of choice. Sometimes students have to learn that. You have to want to learn. And to them, a topic is either interesting or it's not. And it's not quite so cut and dried, so black and white. You can make something interesting, and that's something for me as a teacher to remember, but also for the student to remember. Really quickly, I'm going to tie in from the Hudson and Williams text. This is on page 2, the text, the article about the motivation study. No single literacy activity has a more positive effect on students' comprehension, vocabulary knowledge, spelling, writing ability, and overall academic achievement than free voluntary reading. So I want to focus on the words free and voluntary because this is talking specifically about student choice. So I think that giving students choice in what they read is powerful because it is using this inquiry learning theory, the unfoldment theory, that you need to figure out what you're interested in and pursue that. And if we're not giving students a chance to do that, then they're going to see the act of reading as being something that's always a forced activity that they don't want to do. If we can get them to make the connection between reading and the things that they're interested in and understand that these things can intersect, then I think that they will begin to buy in. I'm going to move on to my final constructivist theory that I want to talk about. And this is Rosenblatt's theory, transactional reader response theory. It's discussed in the Tracy and Morrow text on page 65, and one very quick note to Dr. Griffin and anybody else, just FYI, I'm working from the second edition of the text, so some of the page numbers might be different. So if I'm saying page numbers and they're not corresponding to the one that you have, that's why. It's the second edition. So far, it's been pretty effective. I mean, it's been fine. But just in case, and my citation is going to say 2012 instead of 2017, I think. Just a quick note, but page 65 of Tracy and Morrow states, Rosenblatt argued that every reading experience is therefore unique to each individual. The notion that all readers have individualized reading experiences because each reader has unique background schemata forms the cornerstone of Rosenblatt's transactional reader response theory. I'm a big fan of this theory. I remember studying it in undergrad, actually, and I think that it's pretty foundational to students' motivation. And since we're talking a lot about motivation in the readings this week, I think it's pretty relevant. And the text goes on to discuss two different types of responses, according to Rosenblatt. Efferent and aesthetic responses. So I'm on page 66 of the text. Efferent responses are fact-oriented, and then going down to the bottom of the page, when designing lessons around expository text, we should focus on obtaining efferent responses, which makes sense because when we read expository text, we are reading to gain information because that's what's contained in the text. And then aesthetic responses are personally and emotionally based. And then when we're designing lessons around literature, moving on to page 67 of the text, we should target our instruction on promoting children's aesthetic responses to the text. So I think that's designed around just the overall author's purpose. The author who writes expository writing is usually writing to inform. The author who tells a story, be it fictional or non-fictional, but if you're telling a story, you're usually doing so to elicit some sort of response in the reader. And pulling in Rosenblatt's theory of transactional reader response, your response, whether it be efferent or aesthetic, is going to be based on what you already know and the schema that you already possess. Text connections, that's another thing that I was skipping to page 78. Tracy and Morrow state, or they mention text-to-self connections, where readers are helped to attend to the ways in which the story or passage is related to the reader's personal life. Text-to-text connections, readers are helped to make connections between the text that they are currently reading and others that they've read in the past. And then text-to-world, readers focus on the relationships between what they are reading and the world at large. I have used text connections every single year that I've taught. We kind of learned that strategy in undergrad, and I think it's very valuable. And in fact, the first year I taught reading, we did something called a think aloud, and I think it actually discusses in one of the readings from this week, it discusses the think aloud strategy. And the way I did it in my classroom would be while we're reading a novel together, students make 2-column notes basically, and I gave them a list of prompts such as, wow, this reminds me of, or I wonder what so-and-so thinks about this. So they would write the prompt on the left side, and then they would write the quote from the book that made them think, wow, this reminds me of the time that I fell off my bike, or whatever. And they would write the quote from the book that made them think of that. So that was a really easy strategy to employ as a during reading strategy, and I think that really activates the schemata that students possess and puts this theory into practice. Really quickly, I'm almost done. Tie in from page 13 of the longer text. Let me pull it up. Guthrie, I believe. The one about motivation. Yes, the Guthrie text, page 13. High-interest readers typically reread all or portions of books, pursue topics in and out of school, and connected reading to their personal experience or feelings. So this just kind of goes along with the same theme that readers who are highly engaged and motivated are going to already be making those text connections, whether they realize it or not. I remember I was in undergrad before I ever heard the term text to self, text to world, text to text, but I realized as soon as we learned those terms that I'd been doing those things ever since I was a kid reading. So that was kind of a metacognitive awakening for me, where I realized, wow, this is a really great way to help students understand what is probably already going on in their brain when they read, but it's that much more effective when you understand it. When you understand that you're making a text-to-self connection, I think that that connection is strengthened. And that kind of ties into another constructivist theory, metacognitive theory. I think they're kind of all related, most of them at least, in my opinion. Anyway, this video has been very long, and I apologize. I don't really know if this is an appropriate link for the video, but there's a lot to cover, and I feel like I covered most of it. So if you're still watching, thank you, and I look forward to discussing with all of you and reading your responses, and I will talk to you soon.